Hello, class. It's Mr. Mormon. Welcome to the first lesson in our new unit on ecology. Today we're going to start with just an introduction to what ecology is. We're going to learn some of the basic vocabulary we'll be using this unit and learn just a definition of what is ecology. Now, ecology is the study of the interactions between organisms and the non-living parts of an ecosystem. Ecology is all about connections and understanding the connections between the living things, how they affect one another. We'll be studying the different relationships between organisms, like predator and prey, where one organism hunts, kills, and eats another organism. Competition, where two organisms are trying to get the same thing from the environment. These are all the kind of things that that an ecologist would be interested in. But an ecologist would also be interested in how the non-living parts of the ecosystem affect the living things, like temperature or pollution or different things like that. The effects that would have on the ecosystem would be all part of what an ecologist studies. Now remember, everything that I hand write needs to be copied in your notes. So copy this definition. This picture illustrates the kind of things that an ecologist would be interested in. It says a tawny owl prepares to seize a mouse. The mouse is carrying a berry in its mouth as it runs along a fallen moss-covered tree trunk. The owl, the mouse, the tree trunk, and the moss are all members of this forest ecosystem. The connections and interactions that we see in this picture are what an ecologist would be studying. Let's use this diagram, this picture, to illustrate it a little bit more. So in this ecosystem, we see a lot of biological things, a lot of biology. Biology is the study of life, and we see a lot of different kinds of living things here. Now, ecology is one branch of biology, but there are many different branches of biology concerned with all different parts of this ecosystem. A botanist would be interested in all of the plants in the picture. And a zoologist would be interested in all of the animals. But there's even finer branching than that in biology. An ichthyologist would study that fish. A microbiologist would study all the microorganisms on land and in the water. A herpetologist would be studying this lizard and the frog. An entomologist would be studying the insects. But each of these scientists are just interested in each of the individual parts of the ecosystem. An ecologist would be interested in all of the parts and all of the connections between all of the organisms and the non-living things as well. Here's an example of one of the interactions an ecologist would be interested in. This would be a food chain. In a food chain, we look at how the energy flows through the ecosystem. The grass is getting its energy right from the sun. But the grass then is eaten by the grasshopper, and the energy flows from the grass to the grasshopper. It then flows from the grasshopper to the trout, and then from the trout to the bear. This would be a food chain, showing the way the energy flows through this ecosystem as one organism eats another. Okay, now for a little more vocabulary. We said that an ecologist is interested in the living things and the non-living things. We would call the living things biotic factors, and that would include all of the plants and animals and all the things that come from the plants and animals. Abiotic factors would be all of the non-living things in the ecosystem, and that would include things like the water, the air, the rocks, and even things that you can't see, like sunlight, air temperature, air pressure. All of these would be abiotic factors that may have an important impact on the living things and would be things that an ecologist would study. Pollution would also fall into this category. Another important vocabulary word to understand is habitat. This is where an organism lives in the ecosystem. And then there's niche. This is an organism's role in an ecosystem. It's how that organism fits in. It includes the habitat. Habitat is part of an organism's niche, but it includes much more than that. Not only where it lives, but when it eats, what it eats, how it interacts with other organisms, where it makes its nests. All of these would be part of an organism's niche. Okay, just two more vocabulary words. Autotrophs are also known as producers, and these are organisms that make their own food. These are usually going to be the plants in the ecosystem, which are doing photosynthesis. They're taking sunlight energy and they're making glucose, which is what all cells use as their food source. And that's true of the cells in both plants and animals. Your cells, my cells, need that glucose also, but we cannot make the glucose. We need to eat. Heterotrophs cannot make their own food and therefore must eat. We eat sugars and starches that are then, the starches are broken down into sugars, and that's what goes into our blood, the main one being glucose, the main sugar. Remember, glucose, we learned it as being cell food. In our body, we would call the glucose in our blood sugar. The main thing to remember is that plants are autotrophs and they make their own food. Heterotrophs are the animals and they're going to be eating. They are getting their food from the plants or eating other animals. And there's a final very important classification of organisms in an ecosystem called decomposers. These are bacteria and fungi. They break down dead organisms and recycle their nutrients. So, back to our ecosystem. Could you identify the biotic and abiotic factors in this ecosystem? Think about it. All the plants and animals would be the biotic factors. The rocks, the water, the air, the soil, sunlight, temperature, these would all be abiotic factors. Now, can you identify the autotrophs or producers and the heterotrophs or consumers? That's right, all the plants, bushes, and trees would be the autotrophs. The grass, too. Even the green algae in the water would be an autotroph. Each one of the animals is a heterotroph. They all need to eat. Here's a little diagram that explains a little bit more about autotrophs. Most autotrophs are photosynthetic. They're doing photosynthesis. Those would be the plants taking sunlight energy and turning it into carbohydrates, that glucose, that sugar, which is going to be powering all of their cells. We call them producers or autotrophs because they're producing all the food for everything else in the ecosystem. There is another kind of autotroph which we should mention. This is a deep sea hydrothermal vent, and the organisms down here don't have any sunlight, so they're doing chemosynthesis. They figured out a way to use the energy of Earth to make those carbohydrates, the heat energy and the chemical energy from the minerals in Earth to do chemosynthesis. But it's the same idea. They're making their own food. They're making carbohydrates, and they then become the food for everything else in the ecosystem. Now, this diagram illustrates an important aspect of ecology. It shows levels of organization. Down here, it starts down here with the individual. The individual is one member of a species or a population. A population is a group of the same kind of organism that lives in an area. When we go out to this next circle, we get to the community. Now, notice in the community, we've got all sorts of different plants and animals. That's all the different populations that live in an area. Ecosystem is the community, all the plants and animals, but now we add in the water and the rocks and all the abiotic factors. The ecosystem is all the biotic and abiotic factors. A biome, that would be something like a rainforest or a desert. This is a large geographic area that has the same type of climate and the same type of plants and animals, or a typical type of plant or animal that lives in that area. Put it all together and you've got the biosphere. That's all the biomes together. So let's get these last vocabulary words and we'll be done for today. An organism or individual would be one member of a species or population. It's a living thing. A population is all the members of one species living in an area. A community is all of the populations living in one area. This would be all the living things, all the plants and all the animals. And finally, an ecosystem would include all of the living and the non-living things that make up an area. Okay, I think that's enough for this video. If you have any questions or if anything that you want me to go over, ask me in class tomorrow.